So you kind of hinted at a question here from Brandon, which is, so should the Marlins sell high on some of these players? Let's talk about, and I'll give you the examples. We talked about Stowers. He's an all-star. These are all guys in the same age range. Cabrera, who Marlins fans have kind of been high and low on, but is clearly on a high right now if you don't trust the consistency, or maybe he's made a breakthrough. Otto Lopez, we just talked about. You have some guys in the bullpen, Bender, Enriquez, who just came on the scene, my cousin, who's really throwing the ball well. Are you thinking like, okay, well, this is found money, we can move some of these guys? Or is it more, hey, we've got controllable guys that can help us, this is not what we need to fix? And then we'll get to the Sandy question in a second. But just this pool of players, do you see this being a pool that you would trade from potentially? Or you'd say, let's just check these boxes and focus on other areas?
I think that is it's a tough question to answer because it doesn't have a straightforward answer. It's dependent on things you'll do later. So like if you're willing to sign 1-year free agents or shorter term deals or go into a free agency pool to add players on the back end of that, then you could get out ahead of some of that now and flip players with major league value that you don't see as core pieces of your future team for pieces that may be part of that. Now, I think if you do make those deals, I think you're now in a point where you're less likely to deal for the A-ball value distantly in the future. You might shoot for returns that are more geared toward AAA or now major league value, maybe a contract the team doesn't want to, like a creative way to buy out a contract. There's things that I think you should target in your returns that should have a short-term window in mind. So if you're going to deal these players just for, the highest upside A-ball prospects, I think that's where it's more of, not more of the same, just more of where a fan would get frustrated, right? We have major league value right now. Why would we kick this back? So I think it'll depend. Like if you're going to participate in the 1-year free agency, for example, I'm not asking, or nobody's asking to participate at the Juan Soto level of free agency, but there's also a Gleyber Torres level of free agency where it's like 1 year, good process, found a good player, targeted him, brought him here, he created value. Those scenarios are also possible. It's not just lose as many games and get the highest picks possible. So if they're going to participate in that market, then you can kind of more readily deal from this pool. There's still a couple things that are harder to access. I think highest upside starting pitching, like what Edward Cabrera is at least flashing right now. It's one of the harder things to find in all of baseball. So, but it also returns you or yields you the most in terms of like trade returns. So that's the trickiest one. I'd hold on to starting pitching as tight as I could if I'm them, and then deal from their prospect starting pitching to access position players. But I think outside of Agustin Ramirez, maybe it's hard to develop a catcher that can hit and that can stay like straight face play the position. You need to entertain talking about those guys. You can't hold the line over players you have limited remaining control on if you see a path to like getting your team better, in the short term. So.
Let me ask about Arb, because as a fan, you see Arb and you say, well, listen, this guy's producing this level. You're paying him short term based on what he is. You're not locked into like who was the pitcher from Taiwan that you guys had?
Wei-Yin Chen.
Wei-Yin Chen. You're not locked into that kind of long-term deal. These are guys that are, you're paying them, but you're paying them based on what they just did. So it's not as long-term of a commitment. Why? Like, how do you view Arb for players like this who theoretically will be earning what they get down that road?
Yeah, overall the arbitration process has. I don't know. There's pros for it and there's cons for it. I like when players are finally allowed to kind of prove what their value is, what their value has been, and get a marker in terms of like, okay, the value is stamped at this, even though we know it's a little bit suppressed because of the ARB system, and it's always going to be suppressed and based on player comps. And you need to perform really well to like outperform your arbitration market. But I think it's helpful for players mostly because it just opens up a pathway to them seeing more appropriate dollars to what their actual WAR contribution is, as opposed to in these 0 to 3 years where you could be providing huge major league value and no matter what, you're suppressed in terms of like how you can get rewarded financially for that surplus major league value. And arbitration gets a little closer, and free agency arguably goes past it, which is where you want to be. But arbitration at least gives players a checkpoint that didn't used to exist, right? It just kind of waited it out through free agency, and arbitration was introduced to like address the fact that younger players under shorter control windows are clearly leading to wins and impacting the game. But on the other end, on the ownership side of things and the league side of things, there is an effort to suppress those salaries for those types of players as well. So arbitration to me is overall a positive for a player entering it, but it doesn't reward the player in a 1-to-1 ratio for how good he was. If that makes sense.
It does. And that's why I wonder, if you're the Marlins and you say, okay, Otto Lopez, Stowers, Cabrera, I mean, they're going to be cheaper in ARB in total than what you'd get for them on the, in free agency. And you don't necessarily have replacements lining up, at least certainly not at shortstop,
right? Or
really as a power hitting. We don't really have power hitting prospects like that. If you're the Marlins, you see it slipped into the Wii. I try to avoid that.
Yeah.
But you don't have that many power hitting prospects that you could say are going to slide into what Stowers is doing. So is it almost better to just say, we'll just ride out ARB with these guys or buy it out at a number that's reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it. That's the more likely scenario, to have him go year to year, unless a player is performing at a rate where that the ARB number is going to get big enough to where it's just uncomfortable for you to carry it relative to where you want to operate payroll. I think teams that operate more in the middling or in the top of the scale payroll go more year to year with these guys, or even address those and lock those years in with early extensions and things like that, where you can at least you control against some outlier performance that then now this player merits $20 million in arbitration, and that's where some teams buy out your ARB years. Just because they think that their projection of what you're going to get in ARB is at least fixed relative to you having an outlier performance that in true free agency might yield a huge ARB salary. So it's I think I'd like to see them go year to year with these players, but it feels like they have enough right now major league value for you to at least have the discussion on each of them. That isn't, I don't know, to me, that isn't Agustin Ramirez and Yuri Perez. Those, find where your cornerstones are and then be willing to have the discussion with any team. I don't think anybody should be off the table at all, including Yuri or Agustin, but that's only for the sake of the discussion. You get a real barometer of what those players is by how much teams ask for them. So I would go back to the Rays, and they're a very active deal-making club. So they always have a good pulse of what the value is on the other side of their own players because they're willing to talk about it. There's some teams and other executives that don't want to kind of engage in that discussion, so you don't really get a real sussing out of what the other team feels about a specific player. You get a little cagey and you're kind of trying to present your own side of things in a certain way. But I always found the Rays to be very straightforward and leaning into making deals. And so if that's transferred over, then it makes sense that all of these players would be in discussion or at least entertained. And now it just comes down to how well are you communicating that with your own players. If the players know this, if they know that it's just kind of part of this, then you can navigate it more successfully than if you're not communicating clearly on that front.